When Karoline Leavitt stepped onto that neon-lit set, she thought she knew the rules of the game. She was wrong. Karoline Leavitt's appearance on the Morning Current was billed as a casual policy discussion, a back and forth on the hot-button issues of the day. She'd debated on television before. She'd faced tough interviewers and held her own. But this time felt different. There was a tension in the air the moment she arrived. She suspected something was off, though she couldn't pinpoint exactly what. Still, she took her seat across from Paul Danning, the show's revered host, and prepared for a spirited exchange. Little did she know the next hour would unravel everything, exposing the fine line between hard-hitting journalism and brazen antagonism in a way that would send shockwaves through the entire media landscape. She adjusted her microphone, took a breath, and looked into the camera. The opening segment started innocently enough. Paul introduced Karoline with a courteous smile, praising her recent commentary on media integrity, even lauding her for a piece she wrote criticizing political hypocrisy on both sides of the aisle. Karoline acknowledged the compliment, grateful for the polite tone. For the first few minutes, it felt like any standard interview. But beneath Paul's polite nods, she could sense an undercurrent of something sharper. She'd done her homework. She knew his style, direct, unwavering, sometimes snarky. Yet there was a calculated intensity in his eyes that went beyond journalistic rigor. "So, Karoline," he began, tapping a pen on the desk, "tell us more about why you think mainstream news outlets, and yes, that includes us, sometimes frame conservative voices unfairly." She leaned forward, meeting his gaze. "I've never claimed it's always intentional," she clarified, "but I do believe there's a subtle bias, a consistent pattern in how certain stories are covered. Statistics on coverage times, negative versus positive spin, and the language used, these things add up." Paul's lips curved into a tight smile. "A pattern. That's a strong word. Couldn't it just be that conservative outlets push misleading narratives more often, and reputable networks simply feel obliged to correct the record?" Karoline nodded slowly. "If there's genuine misinformation, sure, but correction and outright dismissal aren't the same. Often it feels like major networks roll their eyes at conservative viewpoints as though they're inherently less credible. That's dangerous." He raised an eyebrow. "Dangerous how?" She folded her hands. "Because it alienates a large portion of the population and reinforces the divide. Media is supposed to inform, not ridicule." Paul paused, letting her words settle. Then he changed tack. "So you believe conservatives aren't treated fairly because we, the so-called mainstream networks, ridicule them?" He drummed his fingers on the table, eyes narrowing. "Maybe that's because so many conservative talking heads traffic in conspiracy theories. Could that possibly explain why they're met with skepticism?" Karoline inhaled, bracing for battle. "I won't deny certain figures on the right peddle conspiracies, but that doesn't mean you lump everyone together. How often do you see progressive figures pushing equally unsubstantiated claims without the same scorn? Bias goes both ways." It was a dance of subtle jabs, each side testing the other's footing, a typical Morning Current segment, until it wasn't. Paul leaned back, crossing his arms. The camera caught the tension in his posture. "Do you think you're a victim, Karoline?" The question cut through the studio like a knife. "A victim of the big bad media machine?" Karoline stiffened, caught off guard. "No," she said carefully. "I think there's bias, but I'm hardly a victim. I'm simply pointing out—" "That's exactly what victims say," Paul interrupted. His voice held a note of condescension. "They claim they're not whining, just pointing out issues. But in reality, they're looking for someone to blame." She blinked. "That's quite an assumption, Paul." He pressed on, ignoring her protest. "We've seen this time and time again. Young voices rise up, claim they want accountability, but what they really want is to spin a narrative that absolves them of responsibility." "Responsibility for what?" she asked, holding his stare. "For the entire country's divide?" Paul spread his hands in a showy gesture. "If the shoe fits." The energy in the studio changed. Technicians behind the cameras exchanged uneasy glances. Karoline, refusing to be rattled, reminded herself to stay composed. "Paul," she said, choosing her words carefully, "my entire point is that bias, left or right, distorts facts. If we can't admit that, we can't move forward." He nodded slowly, but his expression said he wasn't buying it. "Right, but sometimes that so-called bias is just professional discernment. We see nonsense, we label it nonsense. And if your side can't handle that—" She held up a hand. "I'm not talking about nonsense. I'm talking about legitimate perspectives dismissed without consideration." Her voice remained even, but a tremor of frustration ran underneath. "It's condescending, and it's fueling outrage on both sides." "Oh, outrage," Paul said, letting out a theatrical sigh. Yes, that's the conservative MO, isn't it? Outrage and conspiracy. Just toss out accusations, blame the media, and never look in the mirror. The producers, typically calm, seemed on edge. They watched from behind a row of monitors, eyes darting between Karoline and Paul. This was crossing into dangerous territory, but they didn't intervene. They knew the morning current thrived on borderline shock. They wanted ratings and confrontation sold. Karoline refused to take the bait. If we're playing that game, she said, we could say the left does the same. But what does that accomplish? It's the same blame cycle. Paul smirked, leaning forward. Yet you're here complaining. I'm here stating facts, she corrected. You keep calling it complaining. Is that how you frame everyone who disagrees with you? He tapped the desk with 2 fingers as if to emphasize his point. When it sounds like whining, yes. A flicker of anger sparked in Karoline's eyes, but she swallowed it, staying calm. I'm not whining, she repeated. You invited me to discuss media bias. If you want to turn it into a personal attack, that's on you. For a split second, Paul's mask slipped. The frustration in his eyes revealed more than words could. He wanted a fight, a meltdown, something to confirm his preconceptions. He inhaled deeply, then said, why is it that every conservative I bring on this show ends up playing the same tune? We're being silenced, we're being misrepresented, we're victims of the media. It's tiresome. Karoline met his gaze without blinking. Maybe because no one's actually listening to what we have to say. Or maybe it's just easier to dismiss us than engage in a real dialogue. If you consider that whining, then maybe you need to reevaluate your own approach. Paul's jaw tightened. He scanned his notes, clearly searching for something potent to throw back at her. Then he found it. You once wrote, he said, flipping a page, the mainstream press pretends to be objective but takes subtle jabs at conservative culture, painting us as backwards or uneducated. That's pretty broad brush, Karoline. Isn't that the very thing you accuse the media of doing, broadly stereotyping a group of people? Karoline nodded, recalling the piece. I wrote that because I've seen it happen, and I used the word pretend because many outlets do claim objectivity while spinning stories. It's not painting every journalist with the same brush, but it is pointing out a trend. He leaned in, a predatory gleam in his eye. A trend or just a talking point to rile up your base? She stared at him. You're proving my point. You're not listening, you're labeling. That's exactly the subtle jab I was referring to. Paul tapped his pen rapidly, his agitation growing visible. Subtle jab or fair comment? Because I see a conservative commentator trying to use victimhood for leverage. Karoline took a measured breath. I'm not a victim, but you're definitely playing the part of someone who wants me to be. The tension reached a breaking point. The director motioned to the camera crew that they might need to cut to commercial if it escalated, but Paul ignored the cue. He pressed forward. You want to see real bias? He snapped, practically spitting out the words. Try being a journalist who calls out conservative lies day after day. Then you'll see the vitriol, the threats, the lawsuits. Karoline's eyebrows shot up. Are you implying that because some conservatives react poorly, all conservative commentary is invalid? That's exactly the narrow thinking that alienates half the country. Paul's voice rose, his facade of professionalism cracking. I'm implying that conservative rhetoric has done more harm than good, especially lately. The whining about cancel culture, the endless conspiracies, frankly, it's a constant nuisance. A hush fell over the studio. Nobody spoke. Even the camera operators froze, uncertain whether to keep rolling or pan away. Karoline blinked, absorbing his words. This wasn't an ordinary confrontation anymore. Paul wasn't just challenging her stance, he was attacking an entire swath of the population on live television. Is that what you really believe? She asked quietly. That anyone who leans conservative is just a nuisance? He parted his lips to speak, then hesitated. The wheels turned behind his gaze. But the hesitation was too brief to matter. He'd already said enough. In the control room, worried producers realized the conversation had veered into career-threatening territory. The show's sponsor reps were watching. Social media was undoubtedly lighting up with comments. Paul glanced at the clock, clearing his throat. You know what? He said, forcing a smile. Let's go to commercial. But the strain in his voice revealed the stress. The camera's red light blinked off, yet the entire studio remained on edge. Karoline removed her earpiece for a moment, exhaling shakily. She had anticipated a vigorous interview, but this was beyond anything she'd endured. She looked over at Paul, who'd turned away, rubbing his temples. His producer hurried over, whispering something. He nodded, scowling at the floor. In that tense off-air moment, no one apologized. No one offered a truce. They returned from commercial break 2 minutes later, but the atmosphere was permanently altered. As soon as the show ended, The aftermath began. Unbeknownst to Paul, a dedicated viewer had clipped the most incendiary segment, the moment he practically dismissed conservatives as whiners. The snippet landed on social media, amassing thousands of views in mere minutes. Karoline stepped out of the studio feeling equal parts rattled and vindicated. She had not crumbled under Paul's relentless barbs, though she hated how personal it got. The building lobby was eerily calm, as if it had no idea it housed a ticking time bomb of controversy. Her phone buzzed incessantly. Friends, colleagues, acquaintances she hadn't heard from in years. They all had something to say. Most messages were supportive. Some expressed shock. A few criticized her for going on the morning current at all. She scrolled through them in a daze, trying to process the avalanche of reactions. Meanwhile, on the upper floors, producers and executives were in crisis mode. The show's social media team scrambled to control the narrative, pushing out hashtags about spirited debate and fearless dialogue. But the tide was turning fast. Viewers across the political spectrum found the footage jarring, especially the moment Paul used the words constant nuisance. It was the kind of line that quickly becomes infamous. By midday, the network had to issue a statement. It read, "We uphold vigorous debate on the morning current. We recognize that strong opinions can emerge. We value all perspectives and regret any misunderstanding." It was pure corporate spin, and everyone knew it. Karoline back home watched the statement on her laptop. She shook her head. "They're calling it a misunderstanding?" she murmured to herself. Paul's meaning had been painfully clear. Still, she chose not to respond immediately. She'd learned the hard way that fueling the fire too soon can backfire. Instead, she quietly posted a clip of the interview in full context, allowing people to see that she hadn't misrepresented his stance. The clip caught fire. Commentators on both sides weighed in. Right-leaning pundits tore into Paul, calling him an elitist who despised half the country. Progressive voices were split. Some defended Paul, claiming Karoline had baited him, while others felt he'd gone too far, inadvertently tarnishing the credibility of their own side. As the hours passed, it turned into a social media war. Hashtags sprouted like wildfire. #Paul Danning unhinged, #respect all voices, #media meltdown. The video soared past 1 million views, then 2 million. Around 3 p.m., word leaked that several prominent sponsors of the Morning Current were reassessing their relationship with the show. One beverage company quietly distanced itself. Another technology firm, known for supporting open dialogue, stated they were concerned by the tone. It was a PR nightmare in the making. Network executives quickly set up an internal meeting. The talk among them wasn't about whether they'd discipline Paul, it was about how. He was a big name, a veteran anchor who'd boosted ratings for years, but the fear of losing sponsors loomed large. Ratings success meant nothing if advertisers pulled out. Paul, for his part, was unrepentant at first. He raged in private about overly sensitive audiences and manufactured outrage, but even he couldn't ignore the ferocity of the backlash. He refused interview requests from competing networks, holed up in his office, and churned out scathing tweets that only fueled the fire. Late in the afternoon, he posted, "If telling the truth about conspiracy-riddled rhetoric is wrong, then I guess I'm a villain. I stand by my words." That tweet sealed his fate. It was shared 100,000 times, eliciting an explosion of condemnation. The network's PR team scrambled to distance themselves, leaving Paul increasingly isolated. He might have had allies once, but they vanished under mounting public pressure. Karoline watched in real time as the mania escalated. She felt a strange mix of relief that people recognized the problem and discomfort at how quickly the pitchforks had come out. She didn't like mob mentalities, even if they were defending her side. Yet she knew Paul's words shouldn't be brushed aside. She typed out a measured tweet. "Debate is vital, but personal attacks aren't. We can do better. I stand by my belief that media bias is real, and it hurts everyone." She hit send, bracing for the responses. They poured in. Some praised her grace under fire. Others told her she should demand Paul's firing. She resisted the calls to stoke vengeance, but the wave was unstoppable now. By early evening, mainstream news outlets ran stories about the meltdown on the Morning Current. Political bloggers speculated that Paul's career might be over. Leaked rumors claimed network executives were deciding whether to suspend or outright terminate him. The day ended with the entire industry buzzing over the fiasco. The next morning, the Morning Current was conspicuously absent from the schedule. A slate of reruns aired instead with no official explanation. Online, networks posted bland statements. We will return with fresh content soon. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, high-stakes negotiations were happening. Paul arrived at the studio escorted by security. His hair was disheveled, his eyes ringed with fatigue. He marched into the boardroom where top executives waited. They were polite but firm, presenting him with a choice: step away for an indefinite period or be fired immediately. He fumed, pacing in front of them. "So you're caving to internet trolls?" he demanded. "All because I said conservatives whine too much? That's it?" An executive cleared her throat. "It's not about a single statement. It's about the cascade of events. Sponsors are leaving. Public trust is in jeopardy. We have to preserve the integrity of our platform." Paul glared, his jaw set. "And what if I refuse to go quietly?" They exchanged a look. The executive spread her hands. "Then we'll issue a statement that you've been terminated. This is not about censorship, Paul. It's about accountability." He knew the writing was on the wall. Decades of service undone in a matter of hours. With a defeated sigh, he sank into a chair, muttering, "Unbelievable." News of Paul's indefinite leave broke an hour later. The network tried to spin it as routine. Nobody bought that. By midday, advertisers confirmed they'd paused their spots on the Morning Current, pending further action. The outcry didn't quiet. In fact, it intensified. Karoline stayed largely silent, watching from afar. She felt no glee, only a bittersweet sense of vindication. She'd gone on the show to discuss media bias and ended up becoming the catalyst for one of the biggest controversies in recent broadcasting history. Part of her wondered if she should say more, if she should condemn the relentless wave of hate directed at Paul. But another part believed he needed to face the consequences of his own words. On day 2 of the fiasco, the network released a new statement. "The Morning Current will continue without Mr. Danning. We believe in fostering respectful discourse and regret any offense caused." That was it. No grand farewell, no attempt to salvage his reputation. He was done. Commentators erupted with opinions. Right-wing sites hailed Paul's downfall as overdue justice, proof that the media's bias had finally been exposed. Left-leaning outlets tried to distance themselves from him. Some expressed alarm at cancel culture, while others acknowledged that lines were crossed. Internet forums debated every nuance, from free speech implications to the perils of corporate pressure. Paul, jobless and furious, recorded a video from his living room, posting it on social media late that night. He railed against media cowardice and conservative intimidation tactics, claiming he'd been thrown under the bus. He insisted he wasn't a bigot, that he simply spoke the truth. The video garnered millions of views. Comments ranged from support, "Paul is a hero," to outright condemnation, "You got what you deserved." Karoline watched part of it, then turned it off. She felt a pang of sympathy, despite everything. He'd been a titan in journalism once. Now, he was just another casualty of viral outrage, a man undone by his own arrogance and the unstoppable might of social media.